quiet town, a respected man, and a secret life no one saw coming. The night air was thick with the weight of something unspoken. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving the streets slick under the dim glow of streetlights. The old church, a towering structure of stone and stained glass, stood in eerie silence. Inside, the wooden pews stretched in perfect rows, empty but for the echoes of whispered prayers that once filled the air. But on this night there was no congregation, no hymns, no sense of peace. There was only the cold, lifeless body sprawled on the church floor. The scent of iron lingered, mingling with the faint smell of burning candles. A crimson pool spread beneath the victim, its deep color in stark contrast to the white robes he still wore. Blood had splattered onto the altar cloth, staining the very fabric of the place he had called home. His eyes, wide open, stared at nothing. Detective Marcus Hale had seen his share of crime scenes, but something about this one unsettled him. Maybe it was the sheer brutality. Someone had wanted this man dead, and they had made sure of it. Or maybe it was the location. A church, a place of faith, now tainted by violence. By morning, the news had spread. The church deacon, a man loved by many, had been murdered. A husband, a father, a man of God. Or at least, that's what the town had always believed. The victim, Deacon Samuel Price, was known for his kindness, his devotion to the community, and his unwavering faith. He preached forgiveness, guided lost souls, and never missed a Sunday service. But beneath that carefully constructed image was another life, one filled with secrets he had worked hard to keep hidden. Secrets that, in the end, had cost him his life. As investigators pieced together his final moments, they discovered a man who was not as righteous as he seemed. Behind the doors of his modest home, tension simmered. His marriage, once a picture of faith and loyalty, was cracking under the weight of something unseen. His wife, Eleanor, a quiet woman with a sorrowful gaze, had stopped wearing her wedding ring months ago. Their conversations were short, clipped, careful. There was a distance between them that had nothing to do with faith. Then there was the bodyguard. Or at least that's what Samuel called him. Ethan Moore was an enforcer, a man who operated in the shadows, the kind of presence that made others think twice before crossing him. He had no business being tied to a church, but somehow he and Samuel had grown close. Too close. The people of the town mourned their deacon, but behind closed doors whispers began. Samuel Price had been a good man, hadn't he? As the police dug deeper, they found cracks in the foundation of Samuel's perfect life. A secret bank account, late-night phone calls, a connection to someone he had no business knowing, and then, the final clue, one that changed everything. A single fingerprint, smeared in blood, left behind in a moment of desperation. The truth was about to unravel, and when it did, the town would never see their deacon the same way again. The small town of Fairhaven was built on faith and reputation. Samuel Price had both until cracks began to show. What looked like a perfect life was nothing more than a well-maintained illusion, and those closest to him were beginning to see the truth. It started with whispers. Subtle, almost insignificant things that no one would have noticed on their own. Late nights at the church when there were no scheduled services. A tense conversation between Samuel and his wife in the parking lot after Sunday service. The way Ethan Moore, the so-called bodyguard, had become a permanent fixture in Samuel's life. Eleanor Price wasn't blind. She had spent years reading between the lines of her husband's half-truths, his reassuring smiles that never quite reached his eyes. Their marriage had been unraveling for some time, though she had convinced herself to endure it for the sake of appearances. But something had changed. Samuel was more secretive, more short-tempered. His once gentle sermons had taken on a sharper edge. He spoke of sin with an anger that felt personal, as if he were fighting his own demons in the pulpit. Then came the money. A few months before his death, Eleanor had discovered an account she had never seen before, one that didn't belong to their household finances. Large withdrawals, unexplained transactions, and names she didn't recognize. When she confronted Samuel, he brushed it off. "Church business," he had said, his tone final. But Eleanor knew better. Meanwhile, Ethan Moore had his own reasons for staying close to Samuel. He was a man who thrived in the shadows, a fixer who knew how to clean up messes, both figuratively and literally. His loyalty wasn't given freely. It was bought, piece by piece. and Samuel had been paying for something. But what? Fairhaven wasn't a place for secrets. Rumors had a way of slipping through the cracks, and one in particular had started making the rounds. Samuel was involved with someone he shouldn't be. It was an ugly rumor, the kind that spread like wildfire through the pews. One evening, Eleanor followed her husband. She told herself she wasn't the kind of woman to spy, but the sinking feeling in her chest told her otherwise. She watched as Samuel parked behind an old diner on the outskirts of town. A woman was waiting for him. Young, with dark hair that tumbled over her shoulders, she leaned into the car window, her hand brushing against his. Eleanor couldn't hear their conversation, but she didn't need to. The way Samuel looked at her, desperate, almost pleading, was enough. When he came home that night, Eleanor didn't say a word. She simply took off her wedding ring and placed it on the kitchen counter. The message was clear. But Samuel wasn't just unraveling at home. At the church, tensions were rising in ways he couldn't control. The elders had begun questioning his financial decisions. Donations had gone missing. Ethan's presence was raising eyebrows. And worst of all, the rumors had reached the congregation. One evening, as Samuel locked up the church, he found a note tucked beneath the heavy doors. 3 words written in block letters. I know everything. His hands trembled as he crumpled the paper. Who? Eleanor. The elders. Someone else? He turned to Ethan. Find out who left this. Ethan didn't ask questions. He never did. But the pressure was mounting. Samuel's sermons grew more erratic. His voice shook with barely contained rage as he preached about temptation and betrayal. His once admiring congregation now exchanged uneasy glances. Then came the confrontation. Eleanor had reached her breaking point. One evening she waited for him in the study, her hands gripping the bank statements she had printed. Who is she? She asked, her voice deadly calm. Samuel's jaw tightened. You don't understand. Then make me understand. She tossed the papers onto the desk. The money, the meetings, the lies. What are you hiding? For the first time, Samuel looked afraid. Not of her, but of something bigger. You don't want to know, he murmured. But Eleanor already did. Somewhere in the darkness, a decision was being made. The careful balance Samuel had maintained was slipping. Someone had been pushed too far. And soon the facade would shatter completely. The storm outside was relentless, hammering against the stained glass windows of the church like an omen. Inside, the flickering candlelight cast long, wavering shadows along the stone walls. The heavy oak doors were locked, securing the church in eerie silence. It was too late for anyone to be here. Samuel Price stood near the altar, his back to the entrance, his hands gripping the edge of the pulpit so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded like a war drum inside his chest. He had received another note that afternoon, slipped under his office door. You can't run from this. He was running out of time. The doors creaked open, slow footsteps echoed against the stone floor. Samuel's body stiffened. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Eleanor, he breathed, his voice strained. She stood at the center of the aisle, her face unreadable. The storm outside roared, but her presence was eerily calm. Too calm. I need the truth, she said softly, stepping closer. No more lies. Samuel swallowed hard. It's not what you think. Eleanor's eyes flashed with something dark. Don't insult me. Samuel hesitated. He had spent his life commanding rooms, bending people's will with a mere glance. But Eleanor wasn't backing down. Who else knows? He asked instead. She tilted her head. Why? Are you afraid? Samuel clenched his jaw. This isn't just about me. Eleanor took another step forward. Then tell me, Samuel, who are you protecting? Before he could answer, the side door creaked open. Another set of footsteps. He turned sharply. Ethan Moore. Samuel's so-called bodyguard entered, his expression unreadable, his presence suffocating. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not now. Eleanor exhaled sharply. Of course. Samuel's mind raced. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Eleanor had pushed too far, dug too deep. Ethan's presence changed everything. A long silence stretched between them. Then Ethan spoke. You should have left it alone. Eleanor took a step back. So it's true then? You've been using the church? She didn't get to finish. The gunshot shattered the silence. Samuel flinched as the sound rang through the church, a violent crack that sent birds scattering from the steeple. For a brief moment, everything stood still. Eleanor staggered, a red bloom spreading across her blouse. Her lips parted in shock, her hands trembling as she clutched her stomach. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't even seen Ethan move. Eleanor gasped, her knees buckling. She collapsed onto the cold stone floor, the same place where she had once kneeled in prayer. Samuel lunged forward. "No!" Ethan raised the gun again, but Samuel shoved him back, knocking the weapon from his grip. It skidded across the floor, disappearing into the shadows. Eleanor's breaths were shallow, her body trembling. Samuel knelt beside her, pressing his hands against the wound. Blood pooled beneath her, seeping into the cracks between the stones. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with something between pain and betrayal. "You knew this would happen," she whispered. Samuel shook his head, his voice breaking. "No, She let out a shaky breath. "Liar." Ethan loomed over them, his face unreadable. "We need to go." Samuel's hands were slick with her blood. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Ethan grabbed his shoulder. "Samuel, now!" Samuel hesitated. Eleanor's grip on his wrist tightened, her strength fading. "Stay," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "A choice." Ethan pulled him up, forcing him to his feet. "She's already dead." Samuel felt his world split in two, but then sirens. Flashing red and blue lights sliced through the stained glass, painting the church in violent colors. Someone had heard the shot. Someone had called the police. Ethan cursed under his breath, already moving toward the back exit. Samuel lingered, frozen between two worlds. Eleanor's breaths were shallow, fading. The doors burst open. Shouts, guns drawn. Ethan was gone. Samuel didn't move as the officers surrounded him, his hands still covered in Eleanor's blood. A slow, sinking realization filled his chest. It was over. The rain had stopped by the time the police led Samuel Price out of the church in handcuffs. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant murmur of curious onlookers gathering behind the yellow tape. The once respected Deacon, the man who stood at the pulpit every Sunday preaching about righteousness, was now nothing more than a criminal in the eyes of Fairhaven. Inside the church, Eleanor's body remained where she had fallen, a pool of crimson staining the stone floor. Officers moved around methodically, taking photographs, collecting evidence, speaking in hushed voices. But none of it mattered. Everyone knew what had happened. And yet there was one lingering question. Where was Ethan Moore? By the time police searched the grounds, Ethan had disappeared. No car in the parking lot, no sign of him in the surrounding streets. It was as if he had never been there at all. At the station, Samuel sat in the interrogation room, staring blankly at his own reflection in the two-way mirror. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair, still sticky with Eleanor's blood. He hadn't spoken since his arrest, ignoring every question thrown his way. His mind kept looping back to the same image, Eleanor's wide, tear-filled eyes as the life drained out of her. The door opened and a detective walked in. He was a grizzled man, the kind who had seen too many cases like this before. He dropped a folder onto the table and sat across from Samuel, studying him. "You want to start talking?" the detective asked. Samuel exhaled sharply, his voice hoarse. "She wasn't supposed to die." The detective leaned forward. "But she did. And you were there." Samuel swallowed hard. It was Ethan. He pulled the trigger. The detective's expression didn't change. "And yet, he's nowhere to be found." "Convenient, don't you think?" Samuel's stomach twisted. He knew how this looked. He knew how it would be spun. Ethan was a ghost, a name with no real proof attached to it. Samuel was the only one left holding the guilt. Meanwhile, the news of Eleanor's death spread through Fairhaven like wildfire. The local media had a field day with it. Beloved church deacon arrested for wife's murder. A double life exposed, the secrets of Samuel Price. The church congregation was divided. Some clung to the belief that Samuel was innocent, a victim of circumstance. Others felt betrayed, their faith in him shattered beyond repair. The whispers grew into full conversations about the missing money, the unknown woman Eleanor had seen him with, the hushed meetings behind closed doors. The perfect life Samuel had carefully crafted was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, and now the world could see through the cracks. At Eleanor's funeral, the pews were packed. People came not just to mourn, but to speculate, to gossip. Her sister Margaret stood by the casket, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. When Samuel had married Eleanor, Margaret had never fully trusted him. She had seen the charm, the way he could make anyone believe anything, and she had always feared Eleanor would one day pay the price. She wasn't wrong. Standing near the back, unseen, was a man in a dark coat watching. He didn't cry. He didn't bow his head. He simply observed, then disappeared before anyone could notice. Ethan Moore. 3 months later, the trial began. The prosecution painted Samuel as a manipulative man who had grown tired of his wife and had her killed to protect his secrets. They highlighted his financial misdeeds, his suspicious late-night meetings, and the mysterious young woman no one could track down. The defense argued that Samuel had no motive to kill Eleanor, that he had been coerced and threatened by Ethan Moore, a man who, according to them, might not even exist. But in the end, the jury saw what the world saw, a guilty man. Samuel Price was sentenced to life in prison for his role in his wife's murder. He never saw Ethan again. Fairhaven moved on. The church found a new leader, one who spoke of redemption and second chances. The town buried the scandal beneath new stories, new distractions. But those who had known Samuel, the ones who had truly believed in him, never forgot. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of a world beyond the law, Ethan Moore still walked free. Samuel Price spent his days in a cold, gray prison cell, surrounded by men who had long accepted their fates. But he hadn't. He replayed that night over and over, convincing himself that if he had just done one thing differently, if he had fought harder, if he had run faster, Eleanor would still be alive. He had once stood at the front of a church, preaching about faith, redemption, and the consequences of sin. Now, he was the living embodiment of everything he had warned others about. The letters stopped coming after the first few months. His congregation, his supporters, even those who had sworn he was innocent, eventually let go. The world moved on, and Samuel Price faded into the background of a system that had no sympathy for fallen men. Outside, Fairhaven had settled into its usual rhythm, but something had changed. The church no longer carried the same warmth it once did. The pews weren't as full, the sermons weren't as hopeful, and there was an unspoken stain on the community's trust. Eleanor's name lived on, but not in the way she would have wanted. She was the victim of a scandal, a tragic figure in a story people whispered about over coffee. Her sister, Margaret, refused to let her memory be reduced to gossip. She worked tirelessly to keep Eleanor's name in the public's mind, advocating for victims of domestic and financial abuse. She pushed for laws that would make it harder for men like Samuel to manipulate their way into power. It was the only justice she felt she could give her sister. But justice was never clean. Ethan Moore remained a ghost. The police never found him, no matter how deep they dug. It was as if he had never existed. Some believed Samuel had made him up, a desperate attempt to shift blame. Others swore they had seen a man watching from the shadows at Eleanor's funeral. But without proof, Ethan became just another mystery, one that no one had the time or resources to solve. And so, the world accepted the story as it was written. Samuel Price, the respected deacon, had orchestrated his wife's murder. Eleanor Price was an unfortunate casualty of his deception. And Ethan Moore? He was just a name in a case file that would eventually be forgotten. But somewhere, in some quiet town, a man who had once been Ethan Moore walked into a new life, a new identity, a new story. And this time no one would ever know his name.